Have you ever wondered why Elijah was taken to heaven by chariots of fire? Was it simply a reward for his faith? Or was there something more? A secret known only to the heavens, a mystery sealed within the whirlwind. What if his mission was never meant to end on earth? What if the battle between light and darkness did not stop when he vanished into the sky? This is not just the story of a prophet. It is the tale of a man who stood alone against kings, defied an empire, and shook the very foundations of heaven and earth. A man who walked in fire, called down judgment, and vanished before death could touch him. But before the chariots came, before the fire fell, there was a war for Israel's soul, for a kingdom drowning in corruption, and for a people torn between the living God and the idols of Jezebel. And in the heart of it all stood Elijah. Join us as we unravel the hidden mysteries behind Elijah's divine ascension. Secrets buried in fire, whispers carried by the whirlwind, and a battle that shook the very foundations of Israel. Was it simply a prophet's reward? Or was there something far greater at play? Step into the ancient world, witness the clash of gods and kings, and uncover the untold truths behind one of the most supernatural events in biblical history. Welcome to Bible Talescapes, where the scriptures come alive with depth, intrigue, and revelation. Subscribe now and journey with us into the unseen. The sun burned mercilessly over the land of Israel, casting a crimson haze over the arid landscape. The once prosperous kingdom, chosen by God, had fallen into corruption. King Ahab sat upon the throne, a ruler who had abandoned the ways of his ancestors. At his side was Jezebel, a woman of unrelenting ambition, whose heart pulsed with the blood of Baal's priests. She had brought her foreign gods into Israel, tainting the sacred altars with abominable sacrifices. The prophets of Yahweh had been hunted down, their voices silenced by the queen's decree. Any who dared speak the name of the Lord in defiance of Baal's dominion found themselves executed, their bodies left to rot in the dry wilderness. The air reeked of burnt offerings, not to Yahweh, but to idols carved by human hands. But in the shadows of this apostasy, there was one man who had not bent the knee to Baal. Elijah, a man of the wilderness, clothed in camel's hair, his skin hardened by the sun, his eyes burning with a divine fire. He had been called for a purpose greater than himself, to bring the judgment of God upon a nation that had turned its back on the Almighty. As he walked through the scorched land, his heart was heavy. He knew the Lord's voice. He had heard the whisper of coming judgment. But would they listen? Would Ahab tremble before the name of Yahweh? His journey led him to Samaria, the heart of the corruption, where golden idols gleamed under the sun. And there, outside the king's palace, Elijah made his stand. He raised his staff, his voice like thunder splitting the heavens. As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there shall be neither dew nor rain in these years, except at my word. A silence fell over the court. Ahab, lounging on his throne, lifted his gaze with a mixture of amusement and irritation. Jezebel's lips curled into a smirk. A moment later, a gust of wind swept through the court, carrying the scent of distant storm clouds. Then suddenly nothing. The air became still. The laughter of Baal's priests died in their throats. The judgment had begun. The next morning the sky was clear, eerily clear. Not a single wisp of a cloud marred the horizon. The people of Israel went about their day, unaware that the heavens had been sealed shut by the word of a single man. Inside the palace, Jezebel paced furiously, her nails dug into her palms, her mind racing. A prophet of Yahweh had dared defy them, standing in the king's court like an unmovable pillar of defiance. "Find him," she hissed, turning to her guards. "Find Elijah and bring me his head." The order sent shockwaves through the land. The hunt for Elijah had begun, but the prophet had already vanished. Guided by the voice of God, Elijah found himself in the wilderness, near the brook of Cherith. There, under the watchful eye of the Almighty, he waited. The river whispered as it flowed, its cool waters sustaining him. But how would he survive with no food? Then, at dawn, the miracle began. A raven descended from the sky, a piece of bread in its beak. Another followed, carrying meat. The birds fed him morning and evening, as God had commanded. But the land continued to wither. Weeks passed, then months. The fields cracked, and the rivers shrank. The idols of Baal stood useless, unable to summon the rain. Farmers wept over their dying crops. Famine clawed at the land. And still Elijah waited. He knew his mission was not yet over. The drought had turned the land into a graveyard of dried bones. As Elijah watched the waters of the brook of Cherith finally dry up, the voice of the Lord came to him once more. "Arise, go to Zarephath, for I have commanded a widow there to sustain you." Elijah obeyed. Zarephath, a foreign city, deep in the land of Sidon, the very place where Jezebel had come from. It was enemy territory, yet it was there that God had prepared his next provision. At the city gates, Elijah found her, a frail woman, her cheeks hollow from hunger, gathering sticks for a final meal. "Bring me water," Elijah called. She hesitated but nodded, turning toward the well. "And a piece of bread," he added. She froze, then turned to him with tired eyes. "As surely as your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour and a little oil. I was gathering these sticks to prepare a last meal for me and my son. After that, we will die." Elijah stepped forward. "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you said. But first, make a small cake for me, and afterward prepare for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain upon the land." The woman stared at him, her hands trembling. Trusting a stranger with their last meal? It was insanity. But something in his voice, something unshakable, made her obey. She took the last of her flour, kneaded, baked, served. And when she returned to her kitchen, the jar was still full. Her son gasped, "Mama, the oil! It's overflowing." Tears filled her eyes. A miracle, a testimony in the land of Baal. For days, the miracle continued. Flour that never ended, oil that never ran dry. But the battle was not over. One evening, the woman's son suddenly fell ill. His breath grew shallow. His skin turned pale. Then silence. He was dead. A scream tore through the house. The mother's joy turned to anguish. "Man of God, have you come to remind me of my sins and take my son away?" Elijah knelt beside the boy, his heart pounding. This was not the end. Couldn't be. Lifting the child in his arms, he carried him to the upper room. He laid the cold body on the bed. "Lord, my God, have you brought calamity even upon this widow? Let this child's life return to him." He stretched himself over the boy 3 times, crying out to the heavens. And then a breath. The boy's eyes fluttered open. The widow fell to her knees. "Now I know you are truly a man of God, and the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Elijah exhaled. But his journey was far from over. The drought had lasted 3 years. Famine had devastated the land, reducing once prosperous towns to wastelands of starvation and death. The people, once proud and defiant, now wandered the streets like ghosts, whispering rumors of a prophet who had sealed the heavens with a single word. King Ahab sat in his darkened throne room, his face shadowed by frustration. Baal had failed them. The golden statues that once gleamed in the temple courts were now coated in dust, their eyes blind to the suffering of the people. Jezebel refused to acknowledge defeat. Her priests continued their chants, slicing their skin open as an offering to Baal. But the heavens remained silent. Then, one fateful evening, a man entered the palace. Obadiah, the king's chief servant, had spent years hiding Yahweh's prophets from Jezebel's wrath. He was a secret believer, one of the few still faithful. Ahab barely looked at him. "Have you found Elijah?" Obadiah hesitated. He had heard rumors, whispers in the wilderness. "My lord, I have heard. He lives." Ahab's eyes flashed. "Where?" Before Obadiah could answer, a guard rushed into the chamber, breathless with fear. "My king, the prophet Elijah is waiting at the city gates. He has returned." Ahab rose from his throne, his hands clenched into fists. "Bring him to me." But when the guards rushed out, Elijah was already gone. Instead, a single message was left scratched into the dirt. "Meet me at Mount Carmel. Bring your prophets." The challenge had been issued. A crowd had gathered at Mount Carmel. Men, women, and children had climbed the rocky slopes, drawn by whispers of a confrontation unlike any before. Ahab stood at the front, flanked by 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Their robes were blood-red, their faces painted in ritual symbols. And then Elijah stepped forward, alone. A hush fell over the people. He was weathered, unbroken, untouched by the famine that had consumed the land. His eyes burned like wildfire. He turned to the people of Israel, his voice cutting through the wind. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." Silence. The people lowered their heads. They were afraid. Elijah gestured toward the prophets of Baal. "Let's settle this. We will each prepare a sacrifice. We will each call upon our God, the one who answers with fire from heaven. He is the true God." The crowd murmured. It was fair. The prophets of Baal laughed. They stepped forward and built their altar, stacking wood high. They slaughtered a bull, laying its bloody carcass across the stones. Then they began to chant. They danced. They cried out to Baal. Nothing. Morning passed into afternoon. Still nothing. The prophets became desperate. They slashed their own flesh, blood dripping onto the stones. Their voices became shrill, their bodies convulsing in agony. Yet, Baal remained silent. Then Elijah laughed. "Shout louder. Maybe your God is sleeping. Perhaps he is traveling. Maybe he is busy." The crowd began to whisper. Doubt crept in. The prophets of Baal collapsed in exhaustion. Their God had abandoned them. Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt the Lord's altar, stone by stone. He dug a trench around it. Then he did the unthinkable. He ordered the people to drench the sacrifice in water. Once, twice, 3 times. The wood was soaked. The trench was overflowing. Then Elijah lifted his hands to heaven. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel. Answer me, Lord, so these people will know that you alone are God." A heartbeat of silence. Then the sky cracked open. A pillar of fire descended like lightning, engulfing the altar in a storm of flames. The heat was blinding. The fire licked up the water, reduced the sacrifice to ashes, devoured the stones themselves. The people screamed. They fell to their knees. "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." The prophets of Baal tried to run, but Elijah turned to the people. "Seize them. Let none escape." That night, at the base of Mount Carmel, the false prophets were slain. But the battle was not over. Jezebel would not forgive this. The news of Baal's humiliation spread like wildfire. When Jezebel heard that her priests were dead, her scream of rage echoed through the palace. She seized a dagger, hurling it against the stone wall. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. "He dares. That worm dares to defy me?" Ahab, pale and shaken, did not dare to speak. Jezebel's voice was a hiss. "Send a message to Elijah. Tell him this, by this time tomorrow he will be dead. I swear it on the gods." The order was sent. Elijah, still at Mount Carmel, received the message. His heart stopped. Jezebel's wrath was legendary. She would not rest until his head was displayed in her palace. For the first time, fear gripped Elijah. He had faced Ahab. He had faced 850 prophets. He had called fire from heaven. But this was different. This was Jezebel. That night, Elijah fled into the wilderness. Alone. The wilderness stretched endlessly before him, a land of dust and silence. The sun beat down mercilessly, burning his skin as he stumbled forward, his feet dragging across the barren earth. Elijah was fleeing. Jezebel's words echoed in his mind. "By this time tomorrow you will be dead." Fear gripped him like a vice. He had stood against an army of false prophets. He had called fire from heaven. And yet, the wrath of one woman had driven him into exile. How had it come to this? Exhausted, he reached a lone tree, the only shade for miles. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He could go no further. Dropping to his knees, Elijah buried his face in his hands. "It is enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." The weight of his mission crushed him. The people had turned back to Yahweh, yet Jezebel remained. Her power was absolute. Nothing had changed. Sleep overtook him. But as the world faded to black, a hand touched his shoulder. Elijah's eyes fluttered open. A figure stood before him, an angel. Beside him lay a small cake of bread and a jar of water. "Arise and eat," the angel said, his voice calm yet firm. Elijah stared. The last time he had eaten was in Mount Carmel. Slowly he reached out, taking the bread and biting into it. Warm, fresh. He drank the water, feeling strength return to his weary body. Then he fell asleep again. A second time the angel touched him. "Arise and eat, for the journey ahead is too great for you." Something in those words stirred him. The journey ahead? He had not planned to go further. He had planned to die. Yet Yahweh had different plans. Elijah rose. Strength surged through him. He walked. For 40 days and 40 nights, he journeyed through the wilderness, sustained only by that single meal. His destination, Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. The peak of Mount Horeb loomed before him, a jagged monument of stone and silence. This was the place where Moses had met God, where the covenant had been given. Elijah climbed, his body aching, his mind weary. At the top, a cave yawned before him. He stepped inside, collapsing against the stone wall. The weight of his journey pressed upon him. Then a voice. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah's breath caught in his throat. It was Yahweh. Tears filled his eyes. At last, the one he had served had come to him. He poured out his heart. "Lord, I have been zealous for you, but the Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. I alone am left, and now they seek my life." Silence. Then the voice spoke again. "Go out and stand before me on the mountain." Elijah obeyed. A sudden roar shattered the silence. A great wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks, sending dust and debris flying. But God was not in the wind. Then a violent earthquake. The ground trembled, the cave walls cracked, and stones tumbled down the mountainside. But God was not in the earthquake. Then fire. A blaze swept across the mountain, consuming everything in its path. But God was not in the fire. Then a whisper, a gentle, quiet whisper. Elijah covered his face with his cloak and stepped forward. In that whisper, he felt the presence of Yahweh. And the voice spoke again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah repeated his sorrow, his exhaustion. But this time, God answered differently. "You are not alone. I have preserved 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. Now go. Anoint a new king over Aram. Anoint Jehu as king over Israel. And anoint Elisha as your successor. Your mission is not over." Command. Purpose. Elijah's heart steadied. He had come seeking an end. God had given him a new beginning. He descended the mountain. His next mission awaited. Elijah traveled across the land, moving through the parched fields and dying villages. His steps felt lighter now. The Lord had spoken. He was not alone. His first stop, Abel Mahola. It was a small town unremarkable except for one thing. A young man named Elisha. Elijah spotted him in a field, plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. His hands were strong, his face streaked with sweat, but there was something different about him. Elijah did not speak. He simply walked up behind Elisha, removed his prophet's cloak, and threw it over his shoulders. Elisha froze. The weight of that mantle was more than fabric. It was destiny. Elisha turned, his eyes wide. He knew what this meant. "Let me say goodbye to my father and mother. Then I will follow you." Elijah's face remained unreadable. "Go, But remember what I have done to you." Without hesitation, Elisha slaughtered his oxen, burned the plow, and cooked the meat for the people. No turning back. He left everything behind. Elisha followed Elijah. The next chapter of the prophet's journey had begun. The scent of incense burned heavy in the halls of Samaria's palace. King Ahab sat on his throne, his fingers drumming against the armrest, his mind clouded with worry. Jezebel stood beside him, draped in her royal garments, her eyes dark with silent fury. The prophets of Baal were gone. The people were wavering. Elijah had returned. But Ahab was not ready to surrender. A messenger knelt before him. "My king, Naboth refuses to give up his vineyard." Ahab clenched his jaw. Naboth of Jezreel, a simple man, an obstacle. He had refused to sell his vineyard to the king, declaring, "The Lord forbids me to give you the inheritance of my fathers." Ahab had tried to bargain, to reason, but Naboth would not yield. Now, Ahab sat brooding, refusing food, his pride wounded. Jezebel scoffed. "Is this how a king of Israel behaves? Mourning over a vineyard?" She leaned in, whispering, "Leave it to me." She sent out letters sealed with Ahab's signet ring. "Proclaim a fast. Seat Naboth at the head of the people. Then bring 2 false witnesses against him, declaring, 'He has cursed God and the king.' Then take him out and stone him to death." The order was carried out without question. By nightfall, Naboth was dead. Jezebel smiled triumphantly as she turned to Ahab. "Go, take your vineyard. It is yours now." Ahab rose, his mood instantly lifted. He had won. But as he rode toward Naboth's vineyard, a lone figure stood in the path. Elijah. His cloak billowed in the wind, his face shadowed beneath the desert sun. Ahab's heart pounded. "Have you found me, O my enemy?" he sneered. Elijah's voice was steady, unshaken. "You have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Because of this, disaster is coming upon your house. Your descendants will be cut off. Dogs will lick your blood where they licked Naboth's. And Jezebel, her body will be eaten by dogs in the streets of Jezreel." Ahab's face turned pale. For the first time, fear crept into his bones. He knew Elijah's words were not empty. He had seen fire fall from heaven. Ahab tore his royal robes. He fasted. He wept. And for the first time in years, he humbled himself before Yahweh. But Ahab was not a changed man. 3 years later, the king of Aram threatened war. Ahab, in his arrogance, refused to back down. He sent word to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, asking for an alliance. Jehoshaphat agreed, but he made a request. "Let us first seek the word of the Lord." Ahab called for 100 prophets, all of whom assured him, "Go, the Lord will give you victory." But Jehoshaphat was not convinced. "Is there not still one prophet of Yahweh we can ask?" Ahab's face darkened. "There is one," he exhaled. "Micaiah, son of Imlah. But I hate him. He never prophesies anything good for me." Jehoshaphat insisted. Micaiah was brought before them. At first he mocked Ahab, saying, "Go and fight. You will win." Ahab scowled. "Swear to tell me the truth." Micaiah's face grew grim. "I saw Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd. The Lord has declared, these people have no master. Let them return home in peace." Ahab's anger flared. He turned to Jehoshaphat. "See? He only prophesies disaster." Micaiah spoke again. "The Lord showed me that a lying spirit was sent into the mouths of your prophets. You will be defeated." Ahab ignored him. He disguised himself before battle, thinking he could cheat fate. But an arrow, shot at random, found its mark, pierced Ahab's armor. Bleeding out, he slumped against his chariot. As the sun set, his blood pooled in the floor of his chariot. When his body was brought to Samaria, the prophecy was fulfilled. The chariot was washed at a public fountain, and dogs licked up his blood, just as Elijah had foretold. With Ahab dead, his son Joram took the throne. But God's judgment was not yet complete. A new warrior was rising, Jehu. Elijah's successor, Elisha, sent a messenger to anoint Jehu as king of Israel. Jehu wasted no time. He rode to Jezreel where Joram ruled. Joram rode out to meet him. "Is it peace, Jehu?" Jehu's response was cold. "How can there be peace while your mother's witchcrafts and harlotries continue?" Joram's eyes widened. He turned his horse to flee. Jehu raised his bow. An arrow pierced Joram's heart. His body slumped over his horse. But Jehu was not done. He rode straight into Jezreel. Jezebel stood at the palace window, her face painted, her eyes defiant. She mocked him. "Have you come in peace, O Zimri, murderer of your master?" Jehu raised his voice. "Who is on my side?" Several palace servants stepped forward. "Throw her down." Without hesitation, they seized Jezebel. She screamed as she was hurled from the window. Her body hit the ground with a sickening crack. Blood splattered the walls. Jehu entered the palace, ignoring her corpse. He feasted inside. Hours later, he ordered her burial. But when the men returned, they found only her skull, her hands, and her feet. The dogs had devoured her flesh. The prophecy was fulfilled. Elijah's words had come to pass. Elijah, the prophet who was taken to heaven alive. The air was heavy with an unspoken truth. Elijah's time on earth was drawing to a close. He had walked the path of a prophet, stood against kings, called fire from heaven, and seen God's justice unfold. But his journey was not over yet. Elisha, his faithful disciple, had sensed it. There was a weight in the air, an unshakable feeling that his master was preparing to leave. Elijah's final journey had begun. They traveled from Gilgal to Bethel, then to Jericho. At every stop, the sons of the prophets whispered to Elisha, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away?" Each time, Elisha's response was the same. "I know. Keep silent." He would not accept it. Not yet. Elijah turned to Elisha. "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But Elisha's eyes burned with determination. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they walked together. When they reached the Jordan River, Elijah took off his prophet's cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. At once, the river parted in two. The two men crossed over on dry ground. Once they reached the other side, Elijah stopped and turned to his disciple. "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha's breath caught in his throat. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah studied him for a long moment. "You have asked a difficult thing. But if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be yours." Elisha's heart pounded. Then the wind began to stir. A storm rose from the heavens. The earth trembled beneath their feet. And then a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of flame. Elisha's eyes widened in awe. The chariot raced toward them, a storm of divine fire and wind. Before he could react, Elijah was lifted up in the whirlwind. My father, the chariots of Israel and their horsemen," Elisha cried out. He watched as his master vanished into the heavens. The wind howled around him. Then silence. Elisha's gaze fell to the ground. There, resting on the dirt, was Elijah's cloak. His mentor was gone, but his spirit remained. Elisha bent down, grasping the cloak with trembling hands. He turned back to the Jordan, and with the same authority as his master, he struck the waters. "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The river parted. Elisha crossed over. A new prophet had risen. The sons of the prophets stood on the other side of the Jordan, watching from afar. When they saw Elisha part the waters, they fell to their knees. The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. Elisha had become more than a student. He was now the prophet of Israel. But the people were not ready to believe that Elijah was truly gone. "Let us send 50 men to search for him," they urged. "Perhaps the Spirit of the Lord has taken him and set him down on some mountain or valley." Elisha shook his head. "Do not go." But they insisted until he grew weary of their pleading. "Fine. Send them." For 3 days they searched. They found nothing. When they returned, Elisha simply said, "Did I not say to you, do not go?" Elijah was gone, but his legacy was only beginning.